You have witnessed something that defies the narrative you were given about power. The person who seemed unshakable, who moved through the world with such certainty, who made you feel small by comparison, this person has crumbled. And now you carry a weight you never asked for, a question that haunts your quieter moments. Did I do this? Did my leaving cause their collapse? There exists a guilt peculiar to those who withdraw from narcissistic entanglement. You see their deterioration, and something ancient in you whispers that you are responsible, that you should return, that your absence has destroyed them. But what you are witnessing is not the consequence of your cruelty. It is the revelation of a structure that was always destined to fail. You feel it, do you not? The confusion between your natural compassion and the manipulation that weaponizes it. You left because continuing meant your own dissolution, yet their collapse makes you question everything. This is precisely the dynamic they constructed, a system where your departure would feel like murder. Through years of studying the mechanisms of projection and ego structure, a pattern revealed itself with disturbing consistency. What appears as the narcissist's strength, their confidence, their certainty, their apparent self-sufficiency, is actually a compensatory inflation maintained by external energy. They do not possess an internal source of psychic stability. They are a mirror that requires constant reflection to prove they exist. You were not loved by this person. You were used as a psychological prosthetic, a device that allowed them to avoid confronting the void within. And the moment you stopped performing this function, the entire structure began its inevitable collapse. This is not your fault. This is the nature of false constructions when the supporting framework is removed. What I am about to read, all will challenge everything you have been told about responsibility in relationships. The narcissist's breakdown is not evidence of how much they needed you. It is evidence of how completely they avoided themselves. And your guilt, that persistent feeling that you abandoned someone in crisis. This is the final hook, the last mechanism of control, operating even in your absence. The first stage reveals itself in the failure of the projection system. The narcissist's identity does not exist within themselves, but in the mirror you provided. For years, perhaps decades, they have cast their own denied qualities onto you. You became the receptacle for everything they could not acknowledge in themselves, the weakness, the need, the uncertainty, the hunger for validation. You carried these projections and, in doing so, allowed them to maintain the fiction of their own completeness. When you leave, this system collapses immediately. The mirror is gone. The qualities they projected have nowhere to land, and for the first time, they are forced into proximity with the very aspects of themselves they have spent their entire lives fleeing. This is not a process they can control or prevent. The psyche operates according to its own laws, and projection requires a receiver. Without you, they are left holding everything they tried to exile from their awareness. You may have noticed, in those final days or weeks, a desperation in their attempts to provoke you, to draw you back into engagement. This was not love. This was the frantic effort of someone whose entire psychological structure depends on your participation. They need you to remain in the role of the inadequate one, the emotional one, the one who needs them. Your departure shatters this arrangement, and they are left with the unbearable truth that they are the ones who cannot function alone. The second stage manifests as what depth psychology terms the supply drought. What you provided was not affection in any meaningful sense. It was psychic fuel for an engine that produces nothing. The narcissist does not generate their own sense of worth, their own emotional regulation, their own internal stability. They extract these things from others, processing external validation into a temporary sense of adequacy that must be constantly replenished. Your attention, your concern, your attempts to understand them, your efforts to help them, even your pain, all of this was supply. Each interaction fed the system. Each emotional response from you confirmed their centrality, their power, their existence. You were a resource being harvested, and you likely believed this harvest was relationship. When you finally leave, the supply stops. The narcissist enters a state of psychic starvation. And here is where it becomes disturbing. They do not respond to this drought by developing internal resources. They respond by intensifying their extraction attempts with others or by collapsing into the void they have always avoided. You may see them suddenly attached to someone new with frightening speed, or you may witness a deterioration that seems disproportionate to a simple relationship ending, both rare. Sponsors reveal the same underlying truth. They have no self-sustaining core. The engine runs only when fueled from outside. Stop the fuel and the engine dies. This is not a metaphor. This is the literal structure of the narcissistic psyche as it presents in the consulting room again and again across decades of observation. Third, the compensatory inflation of the ego reverses with devastating speed. The unconscious, in its wisdom, operates through a principle of compensation. When consciousness becomes too one-sided, the unconscious generates an opposite force to restore balance. The narcissist's grandiosity, their inflated self-image, their apparent superiority, these are compensations for a core sense of worthlessness they cannot consciously acknowledge. This inflation can only be maintained through constant reinforcement. They need others to reflect back the grandiose image, to confirm the superiority, to submit to the dynamic. You perform this function even in your resistance. Your very attempts to defend yourself confirmed their centrality. Your emotional responses proved their power to affect you. Your continued presence validated that they were worth staying for, despite everything. When you leave, the reinforcement stops. And the compensatory mechanism, which has been stretched to an extreme position, snaps back like a released rubber band. The grandiosity collapses, the inflation reverses, and what emerges is the opposite pole. The deflation, the worthlessness, the smallness they have always been fleeing. This is not your doing. This is the psyche's natural movement toward equilibrium when the artificial inflation can no longer be sustained. You may witness them cycling rapidly between grandiosity and despair, between rage at you for leaving and desperate attempts to convince you of their brokenness. Both positions are false. Both are masks. The truth they avoid lies between these extremes, but they have never developed the capacity to exist in that middle ground where real selfhood resides. Fourth, the shadow returns to its source. Everything the narcissist projected onto you, the weakness, the need, the inadequacy, the emotional instability, now has nowhere to go but back to them. The shadow, that repository of denied qualities, cannot be permanently exiled. It can only be projected, and projection requires a receiver willing to accept the projection. You were that receiver. You took on their disowned weakness and tried to fix it in yourself. You accepted their projection of need and attempted to meet it. You carried their sense of inadequacy and worked to prove your worth, and in doing so, you allowed them to maintain the illusion that these qualities existed only in you, not in them. Your departure ends this arrangement. The shadow material returns like a tide that can no longer be held back. And the narcissist, who has never developed any capacity to integrate shadow material, experiences this return as an assault, an invasion, an unbearable contamination. They may rage against you as if you have cursed them. They may speak of you as if you have infected them with some disease, while what they are actually experiencing is the return of their own disowned psyche. In my clinical work, this pattern emerged repeatedly. The person who cannot tolerate their own vulnerability will create relationships where others carry that vulnerability for them. And when those others leave, the vulnerability does not disappear. It simply returns to its rightful owner, who has no tools to hold it, no capacity to integrate it, no willingness to acknowledge it as their own. Fifth, the false self fractures under the pressure of maintaining itself without external support. The narcissist does not possess a genuine self in the way that term is understood in depth psychology. What they present to the world is a carefully constructed persona, a mask designed to elicit specific responses that confirm the grandiose image. Behind this mask is not another, truer self, but a void, an absence, a developmental gap where selfhood should have formed but did not. This false self requires enormous energy to maintain. It must be adjusted constantly to fit the situation, to manipulate the response, to extract the needed validation, and this energy, crucially, comes not from internal reserves, but from the presence and participation of others. You are part of the maintenance system. Your reactions, your attention, your emotional investment, all of this fed energy into keeping the false self operational. When you leave, the energy source is cut. The false self begins to fracture. You may see them suddenly unable to maintain the mask in situations where they once performed flawlessly. You may hear reports of behavior that seems out of character, though you recognize it as simply the mask slipping. You may witness a kind of disintegration where the carefully controlled presentation gives way to something raw and chaotic. This is not them finally showing their true self. This is the collapse of a structure that was never real to begin with. And beneath the false self is not a hidden authentic person waiting to emerge, but the developmental void that necessitated the construction of the false self in the first place. They are not transforming. They are simply unable to maintain the performance without your energy feeding the system. The sixth stage reveals the emergence of the shame core, that unbearable center of worthlessness they have spent their entire life constructing defenses against. Beneath the grandiosity, beneath the rage, beneath the manipulation and the charm and the apparent confidence, lies a wound so deep and so toxic that the entire personality structure exists to avoid contact with it. This shame is not the healthy shame that signals violation of one's own values. This is toxic shame, the feeling that one's very existence is wrong, defective, unworthy of love or life itself. And the narcissist, lacking the capacity for self-reflection and integration, cannot process this shame. They can only flee from it, project it, rage against it in others, or collapse into it entirely. Your presence, paradoxically, protected them from this shame. As long as you were there to be devalued, to be blamed, to absorb their projections, the shame coup, be kept at bay. You were the defective one. You were the inadequate one. You were the one who failed to understand, to give enough, to be enough. And as long as this dynamic held, they did not have to feel the shame that lives at their core. When you leave, this protection is removed. The shame surfaces, and because they have no capacity to metabolize shame, to sit with it, to understand it as information about unmet developmental needs, they experience it as annihilation. You may see them in a state of complete breakdown, speaking of themselves in ways that seem shockingly self-aware, confessing to being worthless or broken or irredeemable. Do not mistake this for genuine self-reflection. This is not insight. This is the shame core erupting into consciousness without any mediating capacity to integrate it. They are drowning in the very feeling they have spent their life avoiding, and they have no tools to swim. They will either find a new person to help them reconstruct the defenses, or they will remain in this collapsed state, performing worthlessness as desperately as they once performed superiority. Seventh, and perhaps most crucial to understand, the psyche itself demands truth. The unconscious, according to the principles that emerged from analytical work, has a telos, a direction, a purpose. It moves always toward wholeness, toward integration, toward the realization of the self, and it will not allow falseness to continue indefinitely without consequence. The narcissist's entire structure is a defense against this movement. They have created a personality based on avoidance, inflation, projection, and control. They have resisted every invitation from the unconscious to face themselves, to integrate their shadow, to develop genuine relatedness, and the psyche, in response, escalates its demands. What you are witnessing in their collapse is not your doing. It is the unconscious finally overwhelming the defenses. It is the psyche saying, through symptoms, through breakdown, through the collapse of the false structure, you can no longer continue in this way. The truth will be faced, either through conscious integration or through unconscious eruption. Your departure was simply the event that removed the last supporting structure. You were the final crutch, the last defense against the psyche's demand for truth. And when you left, the full weight of that demand came crashing down upon them. This is not cruelty on your part. This is the natural consequence of a life lived in opposition to one's own depths. The psyche is relentless in its push toward wholeness, and for the narcissist, who has built everything on fragmentation and avoidance, this push feels like destruction. They will experience the breakdown as your fault, as the world's fault, as anything but the inevitable result of their own lifelong refusal to face themselves. And you, if you return out of guilt or compassion, will only delay the reckoning that must eventually come. But here is where the meaning shifts, where the transformation becomes possible, not for them, but for you. Your departure was not an act of cruelty. It was the withdrawal of enablement that allowed truth to surface. As long as you remained, you were part of the system that prevented their confrontation with themselves. You were the pressure valve that released just enough psychic tension to allow the false structure to continue. By leaving, you removed yourself from a dynamic that served neither of you. You stopped performing the role of the defective one, the inadequate one, the one who needed to change, and in doing so, you handed back to them the responsibility for their own psyche that they have always tried to place on others. This is not punishment. This is the most loving act possible within the constraints of the situation. You cannot do someone's individuation work for them. You cannot carry someone's shadow indefinitely without losing yourself. You cannot maintain someone's false structure without becoming false yourself. The only option, the only way forward that honors both your life and the truth was to leave. And their collapse, painful as it is to witness, is the first honest thing that may have happened in their psyche for decades. It is the false structure failing. It is the defenses breaking down. It is the unconscious forcing into awareness what consciousness has always refused. Whether they can use this collapse as an opportunity for genuine transformation is entirely beyond your control and your responsibility. What matters now is what you do with your freedom. The guilt you carry is the final strand of the web, the last thread connecting you to a system that required your diminishment. And guilt, in this context, is not a signal that you have done wrong. It is a conditioned response, a trained emotional reflex installed by the dynamic itself to ensure your return. You were trained to feel responsible for their emotional state. You were conditioned to believe that your needs were secondary, your perceptions were wrong, your feelings were excessive. You learned to monitor their moods, to adjust yourself to prevent their rage, to shrink yourself to allow their inflation. And now, even in absence, you feel the pull to return, to fix, to save them from the consequences of their own psychic structure. This guilt must be understood for what it is, not truth, but training. And you must decide whether you will continue to obey training that serves a system designed to exploit you, or whether you will trust the wisdom that led you to leave in the first place. The transformation available to you now is the reclamation of your own psychic energy. For years, your attention flowed outward toward them, monitoring, adjusting, attempting to manage the unmanageable. Your energy was drained into the maintenance of their false structure, leaving little for your own development, your own individuation, your own life. Now that energy can return to its rightful purpose. Now you can direct your attention toward your own growth, your own healing, your own emergence into authentic selfhood. This is not selfishness. This is the proper use of a life, and it is the only thing that can actually contribute to the world in any meaningful way. Not your sacrifice to someone's disorder, but your development into your full human potential. You will need to grieve, not for the person you thought they were, because that person never existed, but for the relationship you hoped for the years invested in a system that could not give what you needed, for the parts of yourself that were suppressed or abandoned in service of their demands. This grief is real, and it is necessary. Let it come, let it move through you, let it teach you what it needs to teach about your own patterns, your own wounds, your own work. And you will need to resist the temptation to return. There will be moments when their collapse seems so complete, so desperate, that every compassionate instinct in you will scream to go back. But understand, your return would not save them. It would only re-establish the system that prevents them from facing themselves. It would only delay the reckoning. And it would cost you your own hard-won freedom. The most compassionate thing you can do, both for yourself and paradoxically for them, is to maintain the boundary, to let them experience the full consequence of a life lived in avoidance, to refuse to be the solution to a problem that only they can address. This is not abandonment. This is respect for the reality that each person must do their own psychological work, and that work cannot begin until the defenses fail. You are not responsible for their collapse, but you are responsible for your own continued growth. You are not guilty of cruelty for leaving, but you would be guilty of self-betrayal if you returned. You are not the cause of their breakdown, but you are the potential of your own breakthrough into a life no longer organized around someone else's disorder. The path forward is not easy. You will carry the echoes of this dynamic for some time, the trained responses, the conditioned guilt, the old habit of making yourself small. But each time you notice these patterns and choose differently, you reclaim another piece of your own authority. Each time you feel the pull to return and you stay in your freedom, you strengthen the new structure that is trying to form in you. You have witnessed the collapse of a false god, and now you must resist the temptation to resurrect it. Now you must live into the truth that your life belongs to you, not as a resource to be harvested, not as a mirror to reflect someone else's preferred image, not as a sacrifice to someone else's disorder, but as a sacred trust to be honored through your own becoming. The journey continues. The work deepens. But you are no longer walking in circles around someone else's void. You are walking forward, into your own life, your own truth, your own possibility. And that is the only collapse that matters now. The collapse of the old structure within you that believed you existed to serve someone else's brokenness. Let it fall. Something true is trying to emerge.